All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another week here of our SaberSim Pro exclusive videos. Today, I've got Will joining me here today, talking a little bit of MMA. I know we have a pretty highly anticipated card coming up this Saturday. Been a little while since we talked MMA here. Wanted to bring Will on and do something, honestly, kind of similar to what I did with Scott a couple weeks ago for hockey, and just like get in, talk a little bit more about some advanced strategies, some process stuff. Hear Will's thoughts on just how to build winning MMA lineups with SaberSim Pro, talk a little bit about the model as well. So before we jump right in, I do just want to mention that this video really is intended to support this video that we did about a year ago here with Will as well on the YouTube channel. In this one, we talked about like the model. I think this was right after we actually put the MMA sims out, but we talked about the model a little bit more, some more basic strategy stuff. So if you're new to MMA DFS, or just want a quick refresher, stay with us here, watch this video, but this one on our YouTube channel is also just a great resource to go back to. It also has Will's old blue hair in it, too, which is worth checking out. So, Will, what's going on, though? How are you excited for this fight? I know we were talking a little bit about it before we got started. I know this is a pretty exciting one. How you been doing?
Yeah, I'm really excited. This entire card is like stacked with a bunch of really exciting fights. So, I mean, I'm hoping I'm going to be live in DFS for them, but you know, I think even regardless, I'm still going to really enjoy what we've got going on tomorrow.
Cool. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. I basically want to jump straight to talking about duplication here. When I think about MMA, huge contests, very small player pool, right? I think it's the first thing that comes to mind. But before I just say that's the direction we're going, I mean, I'm curious from your standpoint, is that something that you think is important for this particular sport? Is this something you're actively trying to address most of the time?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think that's like the worst kept secret. I think everybody, it's getting unique is like priority number one. You know, you don't have to take it like too far and play like the 6 worst underdogs in a fight stack or something like that. But definitely you want to get unique because that's where the EV is.
So on a theoretical level, is that the way that you're thinking about it? That you are trying to play as many unique lineups as possible? Or, you know, another way I've kind of talked about duplication or heard it presented before is that you should be playing the best lineups that are in theory going to be duped less than they should be by like a perfectly optimal field. What's your, how do you think about that?
So I'm definitely like chalkier than most people in MMA. Like I tracking my uniques, I'm usually near the bottom. But like I am pretty good at like the under 5 dupes and things like that. We're finding the lineups where it's like, yeah, I'm probably sharing it with a few people, but my win equity from doing that is much higher than, you know, if you're running 2 fight stacks or something that just simply won't get there anywhere near enough to pay off your entry fee. So it's definitely, I think, like, obviously I feel like it's not just getting unique. It's like you said, getting less duped than, or getting lineups that are less duped than they optimally should be.
Is there like an upper bound to that? Like, you know, if you're playing a lineup, say your expectation is that a lineup is going to be duped 500 times, but you think it should have been duped 1,000 times. Is that still like something that could theoretically get into your pool? Or is it like at a certain point, lineups just need to get X'd out?
Yeah. I'm trying to think through the math of it in my head, like how that would work. It's hard to think like I'm thinking like the first place prize pool is 150K, and like the top 500 places probably play out like 250K of the prize pool this week.
Yeah.
So like you'd be getting $50 back if you binked.
So probably not good. And that's an extreme example, but
right. Yeah. I'm trying to think. So yeah, there probably is an upper bound around there somewhere. Yeah. Don't play like the 50,000 salary, no fight stack, highest projection, highest ownership lineup, because that will be duped 500 times.
And I think, or go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah, it's just like, yeah, I mean, I'm not like thinking about those rules explicitly. I mean, usually like with like my filters or adjusting for ownership and stuff, I'm not getting those, or at least I'm not trying to.
And I think the Sims like themselves even probably do a pretty decent job of getting rid of a lot of those lineups, just because they're going to be like that, you know, the average projected top lineups. But when you're actually going through and like simulating the card and building lineups for those different outcomes, I think it eliminates a lot of the really extreme situations, at least sometimes.
Part of it, I feel like the Sims are better at capturing upside. And I think another benefit is just like MMA is a lot less like solved than say like NBA is. Like NBA projections are, all within a couple of points of each other. Like you're not going to find somebody like this week. Somebody might have like Gon or Jones like 20 points higher than what we have them at. And so there is like benefits in that, and like you will be more unique because not everybody is using the same like mean project. Like they're not
Right.
like, yeah, basically they'd be assuming that John Jones is a lot more optimal than we would or something like that. So there is like, we are, I feel like relatively different than most other sources.
So when we start kind of thinking about duplication, I feel like Geom ownership, this is a good sport for it, at least in theory. Apart from guys in the same fight, there's not a lot of correlation in the sport. So I don't think I would say there's probably not a ton of lineup correlation in terms of somebody is more likely to put one guy in their lineup because they've already got another guy in their lineup. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think Geom ownership as a duplication proxy works pretty well here? Or
yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's not going to be perfect just because there are some interlineup correlations. Like if you are playing, say, Bo Nickel, you're probably more likely to play Cyril Gahn than John Jones because it's a close main event fight and Gahn is cheaper than Jones.
Gotcha.
So you need there is like that salary relief, and like there's probably Bo Nickel and John Jones lineups are probably going to be less duped than a Geom, like just Geom would predict, as opposed to Bo Nickel and Zero. And I'm just estimating on that, but there is like sort of those favorite and underdog or popular underdog situations.
Yeah.
But Geom is definitely like you said, it's better than it is for other correlated sports. Like NBA, Geom of your ownership is just not really as helpful really as it is in MMA.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, I think especially with the smaller player pool that you're typically working with here, those like salary based correlations of the way people will build lineups together probably actually ends up being a pretty big factor here, just because, let's say you're playing the highest salary guy in the entire field. There's only so many cheap salary relief fighters that can be thrown in there. It naturally is going to lead people to building more similar lineups with Bo Nickel in that, for example.
Exactly. And it's also, I mean, it's definitely like lineups that are 49,900 salary or 50,000 salary are more owned than like Geom might imply them to be, or like more owned than they should be. Like there is just like a lot of people, if they're hand building lineups, or like they're not really familiar with UFC and they just want to build like the top projected lineups, like they're going to get very high salary lineups. So like I feel like that is like a crucial thing to add in there with Geom to help avoid that.
So yeah, that was actually going to be the exact question I asked next. So salary is kind of another good proxy for estimating dupes. Do you do anything with like looking directly at like projected score? It's one thing I've experimented with a bit on NFL Showdown, for example, another like contest where dupes obviously really important, is actually intentionally trying to like find high saber score, high likely to be optimal sims where the projection is actually a little bit lower.
I feel like just because of what I mentioned earlier about our projections being like relatively different than other sources, that has like a bit less value, because I do the same thing with NBA and NFL Showdown. I think we probably have the same formula for that. But yeah, I don't think that I'd apply that too much here, because I think that like whenever I'm checking, there are meaningful differences, and I think that you would be missing out on some of like, whether you agree or disagree with our projection, like missing out on like what that value would be from those differences. So I think that like if you were, looking at aggregates or looking at other sources and like comparing it high upside to those projections would be valuable.
Gotcha.
But I feel like you are losing a bit if you're doing it to our projections.
That makes sense, because I mean, what you're really trying to do with something like that is figure out what the lineups that the field is building look like. And if
right. So
right.
So if they're not using SaberSim, then they're going to have different looking projections, and it's a much bigger impact than it is with another sport where like basketball, where it's like we know Steph Curry is going to be projected in like this window for everybody, just because everyone knows he's going to play like this amount of minutes and he's a good player. So I feel like there is more context to be added there.
So when it comes to actually doing some of this in the app, I think, it's interesting. We have a couple different tools that a couple different places in the app in different parts of the process where people can set rules, do things like, address dupes with Geomean. Where do you think people should start with that? Things that come to mind. You can set build rules. You can limit the types of constructions that the builder can build based on Geomean. You can filter lineups out here based on Geomean filters. You can also create metrics to rank lineups. And I think you talked about pros and cons of these in some of our other content. I think it's interesting to get into some of that in here today. But where would you recommend people start with those kinds of adjustments?
I think I would probably lean towards filtering. So my reason for that being is like essentially when you're doing a build, if you're building with like 0, 0, 10 settings, you're getting like an optimal slate sim. Like we're picking one simulation of each fight for the card, checking like what lineup would be optimal in that sense. And so like that is your slate sim. And so if you were filtering out what lineups can be checked against that like slate sim, if you will, if you're filtering that out beforehand, so I think filter is not the right word, but like if it's a rule that the builder isn't allowed to like even check those lineups, that's doing yourself a disservice, because like if you think about it, when you're in the actual contest, you're going to have to be beating those lineups. Like in reality, you do need to beat those chalky lineups. So you want to be, I feel like, checking against them. So I lean towards building it with all available lineups. Like let it do everything, build the optimal slate sims, and then filter down lineups that I think are going to be too chalky.
Gotcha. Okay. So we were talking about upper bounds before. I think that's kind of a good question for here, because you have to, if you're going to filter against Geomean own, you have to kind of set that upper bound of like what's the maximum expected number of dupes that you're willing to play. Right. So just for example, I was going to go look and like see what the flagship is. I think it's like 32,9. So would you kind of start this process by saying like, I want to see, is it possible to play only lineups that have are expected to be unique in the Geomean equation? Or
for a filter, I give it more buffer. Okay. So I'd probably do like Geomean of like 20 or 22%, because I think 32.9 probably comes out to like maybe like 14% Geomean ownership.
Yeah. So if we did unique, and I'll drop for those watching here a video in the description of this that kind of walks through the equation here, breaks this down a little more. But yeah, so like 17.6 for unique.
I feel like I wouldn't want to just like, I feel like there's probably going to be lineups like that maybe have higher Geomean but are like 48.9 salary or 49.2 salary or something like that. So maybe doing like 20 or 25 is my Geomean of ownership. I think probably 20.
I'm just curious. I don't want to actually reverse. I was curious like what the expectation of dupes is for that number, but I don't want to do the math in my head.
It's about 15,000. So it would be like you're getting under 2 dupes, about 20%.
Yeah, let me just see. I'm curious. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let's set it at like 20. I think that's an interesting place to start. So we'll do Geomean own less than 20 here. And I think this is kind of an interesting like example here. So where does your head go when you see like a result like this? Because a lot of times when I use filters and when I've done this for different sports, it gives me a little bit of concern, or like gives me a little pause if I see that I'm trashing like a huge portion of my pool. But knowing that these are viable slate simulations, right? Like these are lineups that were built without this Geomean being inputted into the build, as you said. Part of me thinks that, well, maybe there are. These are 150 viable lineups. Like what do you think about that?
I like seeing that personally. I would probably bump my filter up. Yeah. I just like, because I feel like you can add some values too in like the sorting, things like that. And just now we got a ton of lineups.
Yeah, so it's kind of like there's probably some like
22 here, or something.
Yeah, where it's trimming out like a bunch. So
but yeah, basically like I feel like just using Geomean too harshly you're going to miss good unique or good low duped lineups that like are probably worth having. Just because like there is, the last couple of weeks I've been checking it, even the top EV lineup that I've had was like a 2 or 3 dupe lineup. And granted, those were 11 fight slates, so it's a lot harder to get unique than pretty sure that tomorrow the optimal will be, or the highest EV lineup will be unique. But there is like, it's not a perfect science. Again, like you're facing real people who are also entering lineups, so they're going to miss things or play things suboptimally or things like that. So it's not, I wouldn't just say if it's going to be over 22 Geom, it's duped for sure. Just because there's a chance that it's not, and there's a chance that there's a good lineup there that you're throwing away. So.
Would you like start incorporating salary in here as well? I think like 2 things kind of come to mind. One would be another filter, and potentially filtering out like max salary or
I definitely don't want anything that's 50,000 salary, and probably not even 49.9. But it is a 14 fight slate tomorrow, so there's like an argument for it.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, and that trims us down even a little bit further here. Would you do you think there's any value in what like creating a kind of an alternate saver score that gives a boost to lower salary builds?
I think that if I think adjusting for salary and adjusting for like geometric mean might be good. Like to do as a sorting, like if you're sorting by like 95th or 99th percentile of the lineup and then adjusting that value by ownership or salary, I think would be a good way to like sort of sort those.
So yeah, I was just gonna kind of put one together here. And I'm not on beta here right now. I'm using the production version of the app. I think normalized value would actually probably give us some more creative ways of doing this here, but I don't want to move us now that we're already here. So we'll do this for now. But something to the effect of like, salary, some rank descending. I always get these confused in my head when I'm doing this.
Oh yeah, no, they trick me up. I go back and forth a couple of times.
Any thoughts on, while we're here, the value of average versus product here? I know, we've talked about that in some of the other pro videos here. I think sometimes product can be kind of volatile to ownership discrepancies between what they actually come in as, what we project them. But are you pretty...
I'm always team product.
Okay.
I think I probably annoy Matt with that too, because I'm always just saying you should just take product ownership. But I just feel like it is meaningfully better. There is like for ownership, I'm not saying like for every application, I wouldn't want to take like the geometric mean of like the Sims to give you a player projection or something like that. But for ownership, there really is like, if you're going to be this is an extreme example, but if you're the only person to play a player, but the rest of the other 5 players in your team are super chalky, it doesn't matter. You're unique, So it isn't like, that's something that geometric mean is going to represent a lot better than just average mean.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of just threw one together here. I would say, oops. Oh, let me give this a different name. I have 2 my metrics here.
Yeah.
We'll give this one an MMA name here so we can find it a little better. I thought that maybe didn't change as much as I expected here, but yeah, no, I think it's an interesting idea, like making use of like the filters together and also a custom metric to then help you sort. You see, I mean, it kind of has that impact. We're getting leaving a little salary on the table here now.
Right. But that's a lineup with like Shevchenko and Bo Nickel at the top one that has like, like that's a really good lineup.
Yeah.
Because you're getting like really high projections. You're getting Gone at really high upside. You need a couple upsets in there. You need Jeff Neal beat Shafhat, who's undefeated, but there's no other way to like, you're not playing all the favorites on this card. So
right.
I feel like that's a really good one where you're getting really high upside pieces, but at pretty low salary and low expected ownership. So that's probably going to be pretty good.
One of the other things you had mentioned was like those combinations of players.
Yeah.
Do you think it's worth, I think it would be challenging, at least for me as somebody that's not like, an expert in this sport, to identify what those popular combinations might be. But if we did here, would you ever consider like eliminating them completely? Like eliminating lineups that contain Bo Nickel and Gone, as you mentioned? And trying to like basically flip the build of like what I think people are going to be gravitating towards, or do you think it's a little bit too aggressive of a?
I think that might be too aggressive as like a whole. However, like at the individual lineup level, like I would not be opposed to going through and looking at it and being like, these pairs of players feel a bit chalky together, and like crossing a lineup out like that. But like I wouldn't want to eliminate nickel and gone lineups just because they are, at least in my head, that's what I'm thinking the optimal lineup has tomorrow is nickel and gone.
Yeah.
So it's like I don't, even though they're going to be chalkier, they're also really good. So I'd want to find a way that like I can still have low dupes but still play them.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
I was gonna say there's got to be some signal too as well between combinations of fighters that are going to be used together in lineups, often correlating to fighters that have a high probability of being in the optimal lineup.
Right. Yeah. I mean, ownership is not like horribly inefficient. It is like, it's not perfect. It's definitely like exploitable, but it's not like they're going to make this one person 50% owned who has no shot of winning. Like
right.
Bo Nickel, I think, is like 20% to finish the fight in the first minute. So it's not like that's going to come from nowhere.
So while we have been kind of messing with this here, right, we're obviously, when we're doing things like Geom, we're using our ownership projections. And where do those come from? I know you had mentioned that projections can be very different around the industry for MMA. Are our ownership projections derived from the SaberSim Sims exclusively, or are we using an aggregate there? Or
so I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I just looking at them, I feel like we are leaning a bit more into ours. So like we're definitely like incorporating ours, just because I feel like in my my mental head, I haven't looked too closely at the slate yet. I know that it's Friday and I'm slacking, but like in my head, Shevchenko's like 40, Bo Nickel's probably like 40, even though he's really expensive. And then because of that, Gone is probably going to be up there near 40. So like I feel like we are a bit low, and I feel like we're probably closer towards our optimal rates than like what I'm expecting the field to come in and play at. But yeah, so I'm not quite sure if we're using aggregates or not, but just looking at it, I feel like we are leaning a bit more towards our projections as opposed to field ones.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, and I'll follow up with this and drop a note in the description of this video as well for people watch this later to get some clarity there. I believe it is actually an aggregate, but I don't think it's as robust of an aggregate as we have for something like NBA. To me, it seems like a sport that there'd be some value in like looking around and seeing what other models have for ownership,
especially for sure.
Projections are going to be different. I mean, it's going to affect ownership pretty dramatically there.
Yeah, and projections can vary. And I'm not saying, like, I feel like I want to just clarify, like, it's not like just our projections are different and everyone else is very close together. It's like pretty universal. Like everyone kind of disagrees with one another. And like, there's a certain level of projected points that come from like their Vegas finish lines and everything. So it's like, everybody's going to have at least this much, but then there's a lot of like variation in like the fight styles. Like, are they going to be takedown heavy, which like gives you a lot of points? Are they going to be a high volume striker or a low volume striker? Like there is, a lot of those differences. I don't think a lot of models agree on them. And I think that drives ownership a lot because people aren't thinking about that. They're just using projections a lot of the time. So,
and I mean, one thing that is kind of interesting to me about MMA is like how the two fighting styles combine together when they're fighting each other, right? How does like a heavy striker strike when they're fighting a big wrestler, right? Like it changes. You're not going to get that person's like base rates on what you would normally expect all the time.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, my favorite one is you have two really good wrestlers that fight each other and neither one of them shoots for a takedown because the other's just as good at wrestling. But that's like those, at least in my opinion, are always high leverage spots because I feel like our model does a really good job of capturing it. We take in, like, we're basically including their fighting style as like a determining factor in like what their expected game plan or like average rates are for these stats for this fight. And I think that a lot of other sites that are just like, say, looking at like their UFC stat history and they see like, oh, this guy gets 4 takedowns on average per fight, average him for that. It is, I feel like that is a pretty high leverage spot for us.
And I know, so we can get into the model a little bit here. When we basically, once this fight is over, obviously all of this becomes data that we end up using for the way that we future sim out fights for these fighters here. How do we kind of assign, I don't want to necessarily say blame, but like credit, I guess, for different things taking place in these fights? Like if you have, somebody that is like a really good wrestler versus a striker here, and maybe, I don't know, let's say the wrestler wins, the striker doesn't get like land a lot of punches or whatever here. Like, how do we have a sense of like who's to credit in that situation? Like, is it, I'm just curious on the model side. I think it's...
Stop me if this is like too technical, or like,
okay.
Feel free to ask questions, but basically it's like, I guess I'm trying to think of like a good example, but we'll take yours. That there's a wrestler, and like he went out and he fought a striker. So he's obviously going to have a lot more success wrestling against a striker than he would against somebody who is more well-rounded or is a submission specialist or something like that. So the way that we capture that is essentially like we're looking at what the expectation is. So we're looking at the matchup and we're saying, all right, we expect him to get 3 takedowns. If he gets 6, then he's exceeded. Like that's like takedowns over expectation, if you will, like to make it sort of like a fantasy football type term.
Yeah.
Where he now is getting extra credit because he exceeded our expectation. Whereas if he gets 2 takedowns, that is like, for some people, that's like they would get a boost to their rating because of that. They got 2 takedowns, but because he is a wrestler and he was facing a striker, and so his expectation was 3, he would be sort of like docked, like his rate would decrease because he wasn't as successful. So we're essentially like creating like what the expectation is, which is just, it's not a perfect science. There like isn't a way to know, especially with small sample sizes in UFC.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, we combine all the factors, we take our best guess at what we expect that rate to be, and then we're just adjusting based on how far on either side, or if he was right at the expectation, how much to add or decrease his rate.
Gotcha. And the sample size thing is an interesting point you brought up as well. I mean, obviously, body can only fight so long.
Right.
82 games in an NBA season. We've got fighters on this card here. I mean, you told me before we got started here that are like, 3 fights or less. How do we handle that? I guess really 2 questions there. One, how do we handle simulating a fight out for somebody that doesn't have a lot of fights under their belt? And 2, how do we adjust for future fights when, an additional fight of data for us might be 25% more data than we had the last time we simulated them?
Right. So first of all, there are ways to handle low data. In sort of it's basically in how much you regress it to the mean, basically. So as you can imagine, for most stats, that's pretty high. For something like strike attempt rate, we denominate that in seconds. So if you think about it, if they have, say, only 2 fights, but both of those fights were full 15-minute fights, and then during like each of those rounds, they were consistent with their output, we can be like a bit more certain. We can basically adjust what our certainty level is based on like 1, the type of stat, and then 2, like what our sample size is for it. But like something like knockdown rate, where it's like, for the best fighters, that's like for the best heavy hitting fighters, that's like every other fight, maybe they'll get a knockdown. That's obviously a lot harder to like, that has a lot higher regression. So it's like, if you go out there and you get 2 knockdowns in your first fight, you're going to get a bump, but we're not going to think that like every time you punch somebody, they're going down. So we do account for sample size through those like essentially like initial regression values, or what we add to the data to normalize it. I'm sorry, can you repeat your second question?
So I actually think that was kind of actually a good answer for both. The second question was like, how do we incorporate new data for fighters that don't have a lot of fights under their belt?
Yeah, so it's pretty similar. It just gets added on to our like initial regression, and then it's also adjusted for decay. So there is like an interesting case with John Jones, who's on a 3-year layoff.
Yeah.
And so we're not too aggressive with UFC decay rates. Essentially, we're just solving for what they mathematically should be based on the data. But they're pretty like we're pretty slow to decay things just because fighters don't fight that often and they don't change too much. And there's certain times when like a fighter switches a camp and he comes out with a whole new fighting style, and like those things are just hard to capture.
Right.
But yeah, we're essentially, we'd be taking, like, say John Jones is also going to fight next week, come tomorrow or come Monday, whenever the date is ready. We would add that in. We would be taking like the decay rate. So this one just happened recently, so that it has a much higher weight than his fight 3 years ago against Reyes, basically.
Is there a particular like fight style that is like easier to deal with a small sample set where like
I'd say probably, I mean, both styles are pretty, like, takedown attempt rate and strike attempt rate both normalize relatively quickly. So like both those are the two like main styles. Obviously, if they're like a submission specialist, that does not normalize quickly because submission attempts are hard to come by. So like that is a bit trickier, but takedown attempts, strike attempts are both pretty quick. But something like strike accuracy, significant strike rate, knockdown rate, like basically the substats of that fighting style, or like takedown accuracy, those can vary a lot, and those do take longer to normalize. Like there's fighters like I want to say it's Alexa Grasso who only has like 64% of takedowns defended in her UFC career with like 6 or 7 fights. But I would not say that Valentina Shevchenko's takedown accuracy for this fight is going to be 36%. Like that is something where like that rate probably hasn't normalized. So it is like, where she's going to take her down a couple of times, but it's not, she's not just going to like knock her over like the wind.
Yeah. Gotcha. So we talked a little bit about like adjusting some ownership projections based on looking at other models, looking at some research. In terms of the projections themselves, like, is there a particular direction you would give people that wanted to spend a little bit more time researching and making some adjustments, either in like how to identify maybe what fighters to take a closer look at, or what stats or resources they should actually go to do those kinds of things?
So if you want to pull it up, UFCstats.com is like a great resource. You can just click on Jones versus Gone, and and then you can click on like John Jones or something like that, and it'll have a pretty good summary stats there at the top. Like they do the career statistics, and like those are a good starting point. And for somebody with a good sample size, like someone like Charles Johnson that's fought a lot recently, those are going to be like probably pretty close to normalized rates. So like that is something where if you like say John Jones's takedown average is 1.85, and you look at it and we have 3 or we have 0.5 or something like that, that's something worth like adjusting for. We do all of the stats that like go into UFC stats. They're just taking fights that fall under like the UFC banner. So like those are data points that our model is considering. And so I feel like a bigger edge comes from fighters making like their debut or something like that. And so there is a, like, I want to put this out as a disclaimer, like somebody like Bo Nickel this week, where I bumped what his takedown rate is. And so that is something where like, if you go to his UFC stats page, he only has 2 fights that fall under that because they were the 2 Contender Series fights. And so his takedown average is 23.68. But if you like realistically with the initial regression values, because he's only fought for 2 minutes or 1 minute and 54 seconds of fight data, that's going to be regressed a lot. And so it was too low when we first ran for Bo Nickel.
Gotcha.
And that's something where I was like, he is a wrestler. He is just going to go out there and do a lot of takedowns. And so we need to bump his rate in order to have what should be a good, accurate projection. So that's something where, like, if you disagree with that, if you think Bo Nickel is not going to wrestle that much, or if you think he's going to wrestle more, that is a good place to add. But I would definitely make sure to be looking at what our projected stats are. Right. Because there are cases where, like, if something is wrong, I follow UFC pretty closely, so I will oftentimes go in and like adjust it if I know something is going to be like tricky like that, where it's like if there's just not the data, but this guy is obviously this type of fighter or something like that, we will adjust it. So it isn't like, you shouldn't just assume that we're going to represent whatever like their average historical stats have been, because we are making some adjustments there.
Gotcha. But starting from a place of like fighters that don't have a lot of data or don't have a lot of recent data as a way to just, there's naturally going to be more variance in the projection there for those guys, and making that your start as the research, I think, makes a lot of sense there.
Right. So like there's another fight, I think it's Luke Rajabov versus I forget who he's facing, but Emil Rybovich maybe. And that's a fight where I think they're both making their UFC debut, or they're one fight in for one of them. And so that's something where like, they're going to have pretty close to like what we're expecting average fighters to be, like what the average rate is.
Yeah.
And that's something where it's not entirely clear. Like I've made like a few tweaks, because I think that like Rajabov is probably going to wrestle a little bit, but it's not like, that's not like a strong stance that I have. And that's something that like I feel like if you have watched their tape, like I've not gone and like watched their regional scene fights or something like that, if you do that and something that like other people don't, or is not common knowledge, that is a really good place to add it, is on those debuting fighters.
And one thing I like to do in these situations here is just try to figure out, are these going to be chalky plays, right? And embrace the variance on one side or the other. Like if you're going through, I mean, it seems like we have like a moderate ownership projection here for Bo Nickel, but if that comes up over the course of the day, today and tomorrow, or maybe you're doing a little bit more ownership research and he's going to be like a very chalky play, I think there's almost just a game theory argument there of just saying, look, there's 2 fights that have data for this guy, and maybe I'm going to actually assume that like he's going to wrestle a little bit less, or just be a little bit less effective of a fighter, or this fight here that you pointed out, right?
Yeah.
If they're maybe just not going to be very popular plays, right? I mean, it seems like there's some elite plays in the 9K range here, and you're thinking no one's going to get to Rajabov here. There's no data on this fight, right? And maybe you just assume that that's like a situation where you can get a little bit of leverage just getting more of that fighter into your lineups and embrace the variance there.
Right. Yeah. I'm definitely in favor of that. I would not be in favor of that for Bo Nickel this week.
Yeah. Okay.
Even if you just assumed that they gave him no stats for like, he didn't throw a strike, he didn't get a takedown or anything. If he just did nothing, they only gave him his finish points, I think he's still probably in the optimal often enough. He's just, they've gave him somebody that cannot wrestle, and he's just really good. So it's a really hard fight to fade, and more power to you if you can.
Yeah.
The best case outcome I feel like that you're looking for is that he gets the finish at 1 minute and 1 second, so he doesn't get the quick win bonus, and he'll score 99 or something like that. But that's just like, that's gonna be a rough 1 minute to be fading.
So on that note, I wanted to ask, I think the last time we had did one of these, you had mentioned to be careful with projection adjustments because of the way that they impact the percentiles and the win sims for these fighters. Can you, unless I'm like misquoting you there, can you give me a little more context again on like what you mean by that, and maybe we can talk about like how you would actually safely adjust projections if somebody wanted to?
Yeah, so like say let's just like take like a random fighter like Basharat or something like that. So he's about like 10 down.
Yep.
Yeah. So he is like pretty average like stats wise. We're not like entirely sure what to do, not a ton of data, but say like you think he's gonna wrestle a ton and you bump him 10 points before the build. The way that is working in the sims is like essentially applying like an increasing modifier to like each of his sims. So it's like in each of the sims, like he has his raw points, but you're saying that he should be 10 points higher on his mean, so he's getting a 10-point increase. And I can't remember how Matt said that's done, if it's addition or multiplication.
I think it's additive.
Yeah, so it would be basically he gets plus 10 on every sim. And that can get pretty wonky if you aren't, like it's sort of, at the edge of it, but like he scores 70 in a decision or something like that, or he gets a robbery, like he dominates the fight, but like the other guy gets the decision, he gets like 50 points, and now in your sim you've bumped him up to 60. that's not, I feel like, not really representative of what you wanted to do. Like you're essentially crossing into turning a loss into a win kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas like if you're doing it after the build, after you've built out like what optimals like might look like, and then you're saying, I want more of Basharat, you're getting lineups that are, I guess, like pure, if that makes sense. They're not adjusted. But then you are saying like Basharat's going to win more often than you think. So when you bump him, you're going to get more of the lineups that contain him. That's, yeah, I feel like that's where I'm trying to go with it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, I mean, as a general rule, making adjustments to projections post-build rather than pre-build just to avoid that. I mean, I think you can, even at the like 99th percentile extremes, you can get to weird situations where like maybe a fighter that is projected to win often by decision, and you think they're actually going to win more than their Vegas odds imply, a projection bump could actually push some of those sims into like winning inside the distance territory, when in reality that's very unlikely to happen.
Right. I think that's a good example of something like you could give, like, say there's a sim where Basharat gets the quick win bonus. He goes out there and knocks him out in the first minute.
Mm-hmm.
You're essentially adding an additional 10 points on top of that, which is just like not going to happen. Like when you're getting that quick win bonus, you're usually around like 125. And then if you're like really lucky and got 2 knockdowns, you're at 135. But like if he got one of those sims and then a 10-point bonus on top of that, you're saying that he scored 145 and like is just like completely nuclear, which I feel like isn't what you really want it to do, basically.
One thing I wanted to ask about, I saw it in my notes here and I remembered. So switching gears just like a little bit, but when we had built this metric before, you said 99th percentile, and that stood out to me a little bit. One thing that Matt and I have talked about here is old like Saber Score 1.0 versus percentiles for sports where you essentially need the optimal to win. Do you have any concern about something like 99th percentile unnecessarily punishing sims where the scoring is just very low?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I feel like there's less of a risk on this specific card, just because it has like a really high finish rate.
Yeah.
But no, I do see what you're saying. That is interesting. Like theoretically, you want it to be 99th percentile of like points minus average of all lineups.
Yeah, it gets weird, and when I think about this too hard, my brain starts to hurt. But I think in like NFL Showdown, it is a really easy example of like you will essentially eliminate most kickers and defenses from your pool if you use 99th percentile as your sorting method, because the lineups with the highest 99th percentile scores are the ones where there is just a lot of scoring happening. I think Showdown for NFL is a little bit different because you're talking about a single game, whereas here we're talking about 14 different fights.
Right.
And somebody has to win each one. So I think...
Wait, don't jinx us.
Yeah, right.
No more draws, please.
Yeah, I think I think it will do a little bit better of a job. And I think you make a good point on a this is probably less of an issue on a larger card. I could see this maybe being something to at least consider on like a much smaller card. But it's an interesting one. I have noticed, I think I tend to like the way that 99th percentile works as kind of the upside portion of a metric used, but yeah. It's interesting to think about there.
Yeah, definitely. I had not considered that. Something, maybe doing something like, no, I guess 99 minus average still, you run into the same issue. Yeah, it's a tricky thing there.
I wanted to ask, in this build here, do you have any thoughts on like diversification here? I'm actually releasing a video, I think later this afternoon, about diversification, and MMA is the example I used in that video, talking about it's going to be harder to additionally diversify your lineups with things like min uniques or even player exposures if you're already filtering out a lot of lineups and then using a metric and things like that. But is that something that is important to you in your process?
So I feel like I'm against min uniques usually in MMA. Okay. I think that, like, say you have a really good lineup, it's like one of maybe like the second one or even the first one would probably work. You could have that first lineup and then also have John Jones where you have Serial gone. You could just 1-to-1 swap them for the main event, and I think both lineups are probably good. And like one obviously may be more duped than another, and one is probably better than another, but I wouldn't want to like arbitrarily remove that because like there are only so many lineups. I think there's, if I remember from when I was checking it, like there's only like 13,000 legal lineups that can bank. So like I did 50,000 slate sims, and there's only like 13,000 that like win even a single one. So if you are using like min uniques, you're going to like pretty quickly work your way through that pool, because like for each one you're tossing out other lineups for sharing too many players. So I feel like it doesn't work as well as it does for something like, you know, MLB, where there's trillions of lineups or whatever that number is. So I feel like there's definitely value in diversification, and like, don't get me wrong, like it may be optimal to play like 90% Jeff Neal or something like that, but that does not mean that I want 90% of my lineups to sit there and watch a big underdog just get stomped. So like I'm probably too aggressive with diversification, just because I like I think what I'm trying to maximize is not necessarily EV, but like UV, utility value, like trying to maximize, like if I'm not going to profit, can I at least get some money back?
And that was like one of the things that in the video I recorded today I talked about, is that like there is value to maintaining some level of your bankroll to give yourself a shot the next time there's a slate. So, but I mean, also like this is not an undiversified portfolio, right? I mean, we are, I would say, fairly conservative with some of these exposures we're getting here, and that's sim diversity at work, right? I mean, like that's simulating the slate out 2,500 times and then picking out slate optimals here is naturally going to diversify you quite a bit.
Like nobody's optimal 100% of the time. So like theoretically, like if your exposure matched optimals, you wouldn't ever have 100% of anybody. So like, I think that if you are just like doing something like this, like I'm usually, my top exposure is usually in like the 60 to 70% range. So like I feel like that is like probably a well diversified portfolio. So I would definitely like not go too overboard. Don't like, it's not Daytona. You don't need to cap everybody at 30%.
Yeah. I mean, do you think there is, you know, I have become pretty anti-exposure, to be honest, especially like post-min uniques. I just don't see a lot of use for it anymore. Do you think there's any value in like putting a cap, even just like a relatively high cap, and avoiding like exposure, 100% exposure to a fighter on the right card or something like that? Or beyond like what we've talked about process-wise elsewhere here, are you, I guess that's actually a better way to phrase this. Is there like a ceiling that you're comfortable with exposure to any given fighter on a card?
I mean, if you told me I had 100% Bo Nickel tomorrow, I wouldn't be mad at you. So like I wouldn't make a steadfast rule to never have 100% owned. But like I wouldn't want 100% of Surreal gone. So it is like fighter dependent. And I don't know if that's like incorrect of me to say from like an EV perspective or something, but just like how I feel about my lineups going, I would feel much better with like somebody who is a really high win percentage and really high score. I wouldn't hate to have 100% of them, but like I definitely wouldn't be like slamming underdogs that high.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, we are at almost 50 minutes here. It feels like these always go super fast. We get talking and things start going fast. But is there anything that we missed here? We've covered a lot, talked a lot about duplication, some stuff on the model and making some adjustments there, diversification here towards the end. Anything else that you think, you know, people should consider, take a look at, make a part of their process when it comes to MMA?
I mean, not really. The only thing I would say is like if you're looking for research to add it, looking at like regional scene fights, they're not usually recapped from a stats perspective. So it's not like you can look up and be like, okay, he had 3 takedowns in this fight, which makes them a lot harder for most models to use them, of course, because like it's just a video. But like if you have the time and you really want to dig into some of these prospects, like going and looking up like Loic Radzhabov's, you know, regional scene fights, and you know, like that will give you value that other people don't necessarily have.
That's a good one. That's like the ultimate 80 hours a week, hand in the dirt,
if you are
your take.
Respect to people who can do that. I don't think I could do it even if I had the time to. So
Cool. All right. Well, I appreciate you having the time to do this and come on and talk to me. I learned a ton. I am now like very excited to play this card. I feel like that always happens when I do these for something upcoming. I get pretty excited about it here. So best of luck to you and your lineups tomorrow. And to everybody watching, again, appreciate you guys as always. If you have questions for us, comments, questions for Will, fire away in the Pro channel in Discord. And if you happen to watch this video by clicking on the link in the banner of the app, and you don't know about the Pro Discord already, you're missing out. I think it's like probably one of the coolest spots for conversation in our community in general. Got a lot of sharp minds in there every day. When we post a video, there's a lot of back and forth discussion going on there. So your Pro subscription that you already have gets you access to this channel. So join the Discord, verify your account, get access to that Pro channel and be a part of the conversation there. But we'll be back again for another Pro video next week on something else. Figure it out next week. Will, thank you again for hopping on. And in the meantime, see you guys later.
Yeah, thanks for having me.